Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Heather Rice-Minus. I'm the Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Church Mobilization for Prison Fellowship. And we're delighted to be here today to have this briefing on the conservative case for the Equal Act. I want to thank our co-sponsors of this briefing, FAM, the Due Process Institute, as well as the Justice Action Network. And I'm joined by a very distinguished panel of experts who are going to be speaking to this today. But just before we get started, I'm going to have a little bit of an introduction to the issue and the legislation we're talking about. And I also, just as a housekeeping matter, want to encourage those who are joining us today to put any questions you may have into the chat or into the Q&A, I should say. So if you have questions along the way, we'll try to pose those to our panelists as we go. We'll get started. So just for those who may not be familiar, I want to give a little bit of an overview of how we got to where we are and why the Equal Act is something we're pushing for today. So some of your bosses may have been around in 1986 when the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was established and gave very different federal sentencing structures for crack versus powder cocaine. The bill was bipartisan, and at several key junctures, it was Democratic lawmakers arguing for higher penalty disparities for crack cocaine. Under the law, 5 grams of crack cocaine distribution triggered the same mandatory sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine. And that's how we have the infamous 100-to-1 disparity some of you may have heard of. And as you'll be hearing today, that disparity failed to advance the public safety goals that were intended, but it has contributed to great over-incarceration in the federal system. Crack cocaine is more widely used, we know, in low-income communities and marginal communities of color. And in these communities, the lengthy federal sentences that were doled out for crack cocaine created weakened family structures, as well as limited economic opportunity. In 2010, luckily, the Congress passed the Fair Sentencing Act, and that reduced the disparity between how we punish crack versus powder cocaine down from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1. But that 18-to-1 disparity still exists today. Another piece of legislation that's affected this sentencing structure is the First Step Act. In 2018, when the First Step Act passed, it allowed for individualized case-by-case review of people sentenced under the prior 100-to-1 penalty structure to be resentenced consistent with the 18-to-1 Fair Sentencing Act. And in fact, we have Matthew Charles here today as one of our panelists who benefited from that reform. But today, the Equal Act, which is bipartisan and bicameral legislation, it would finally ensure that the same amounts of crack and powder cocaine trigger the same federal sanctions. It allows for retroactive sentencing reductions for individuals sentenced under to the 18-to-1 structure. And for Prison Fellowship, as the nation's leading Christian nonprofit ministering to those in prisons, their families, and formerly incarcerated people, for us, this is a matter of proportionality. It's also what we believe is best for public safety and to advance goals with limited resources. And we also believe this is a matter of racial justice as well. So we're really passionate about this, and it's timely that we're having this briefing this week. Because of what's happened in the House. In the Equal Act just passed by an overwhelming margin of 361 to 66, and that included 143 Republicans in support of the legislation, 26 House Republican members ranging from Freedom Caucus policymakers like Gomert, Moore, and Massey, as well as Main Street members like McMorris Rodgers have co-sponsored this legislation. And I want to give thanks to our Senate sponsors, of course. You can look up the bill details and co-sponsors S79, but introduced by Senators Booker and Durbin, Portman, Paul, Tillis, and Leahy have all co-sponsored. And we also know that there's a lot of great support from center-right groups, faith groups, law enforcement groups, including those who are co-hosting this briefing, as well as those who are speaking on the panel. And I also want to recognize support from Major Cities Chiefs Association, as well as Americans for Prosperity, Association for Prosecuting Attorneys, Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition, Americans for Tax Reform, ALEC Action, and Faith and Freedom Coalition. You know, given this depth of support across so many different organizations, so many Republican lawmakers in the House and in the Senate. We just believe that and want to urge the Senate to pass this legislation. We believe the time is now. It's been far too long that we've had this disparity on the books, and we believe that we can solve that with the Senate taking this up quickly and surely, now that we've seen the House vote be so overwhelming. And so with that, I want to turn to our panelists. And again, I want to remind folks, if you do have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A so we can get to it. But I want to introduce Matt Whitaker, who's with us today. Matt is former Acting Attorney General of the United States and former United States Attorney of the Southern District of Iowa. And if that's not impressive enough for you, he was also the starting tight end for the Iowa Hawkeyes in the 1991 Rose Bowl. And so, Matt, my opening question for your initial statement, just to frame it up a little bit, is, how, as a former federal prosecutor, do you see the costs of crack powder cocaine disparity for justice and public safety, and how has that led to your current support for the Equal Act?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and hello to everyone who's joining us. I know I have several friends that are watching right now. And, as a former federal prosecutor and someone that's been at the highest levels at Maine Justice, what I saw is a couple things. First, I think we, with the crack disparity, whether it was 100 to 1 or whether when it was changed after I was done being U.S. Attorney to the lower ratio, I think you saw the incentive for drug dealing organizations to, quote unquote, rock it up as close to the customer as possible. And so with those disparities, what you ended up getting were the low-level drug dealers with significant quantities, which is not the purpose of federal prosecution. At least in my mind, the purpose of federal prosecution is to get the worst of the worst, the kingpins, the drug trafficking organizations, the folks that, about one step takes you out of the country and into places like Mexico and China and otherwise. And so, I think to some extent, those drug dealing organizations knew not to distribute crack until it got to the distribution on the street locations. And so the purpose of the disparity probably did not accomplish its goal. At the same time, with for various reasons that we again probably don't have enough time to talk about today, this crack cocaine was predominantly used in African American communities, although not exclusively. We all know that, and the disparity then was pronounced that we saw through this. I think the other thing that we're learning is that obviously the addictiveness of both powder cocaine and crack cocaine is substantially similar. And so I think as we look at this, as we look at making policy, I was a executive branch. My job was to execute the law that Congress passed dutifully and appropriately. But it just ended up, I think, distorting where we allocated federal law enforcement resources. And I think that's what, as I've studied this issue and become more and more comfortable, what I understand is, if we're doing our job well at the federal law enforcement level, we're going after drug trafficking organizations, the worst of the worst, the violent criminals that are, kind of doing this to our communities. And I just don't think that, with those priorities that you can justify this disparity.
Thank you for that, Matt. And I look forward to delving into some more of the details from you. Matthew, Charles, I'd love to move to you next for an opening statement. And just to frame up for anyone who may not be familiar with you yet, Matthew was actually the first beneficiary of the First Step Act. Some may remember him from being featured at the president's State of the Union. And in 1996, Matthew was sentenced to 35 years in prison for felony drug and firearm charges in Tennessee. And you served 21 years of those before the sentencing guidelines changed to address the disparity between crack and powder cocaine. And so, Matthew, why don't you just share with us in your opening statement how the federal crack cocaine disparity impacted your life, specifically as it relates to your conviction, and why you believe it's crucial to complete the work of the Fair Sentencing Act now and end the crack powder cocaine disparity for good.
Okay, thank you, Helen. Hello to everyone that's viewing. My name is Matthew, and like Heather stated, in 1996, I was given a 35-year sentence for 216 grams of crack cocaine. Had that been powder cocaine, the equivalent to that was 11.2 grams. So a person with 11.2 grams would have received a sentence far less what I received at it being 100 to 1. And when I went in with 35 years, I didn't fully understand it. I understood that a war on crack, war on drugs had been waged. And because this drug was new on the scene and kind of unknown, a lot of people moved in fear and hastiness. And the 100 to 1 ratio, as Heather has stated, was passed in 1986. So once I was sentenced to 35 years, the sentence was incredulous to me. But as I went in and started serving my amount of time, I was able to see so many other people that had similar sentences of 30 to life or life sentences or double life sentences for this nonviolent drug offense. And then we were able to see that the majority of those that were sentenced to such sentences did look like me. So it had a predominant effect on African Americans and people of color. It has devastated communities. And today, I'm glad, even with the passage in the House, that it seems like we're on the right side of history. And what I mean by that is crack cocaine ratio between the powder cocaine has been getting chipped at for a while now. But finally, we at a crossroads to where we're able to eliminate it altogether. And the fact that there is a disparity between two drugs that are literally the same pharmacological. So therefore, I just think that today, with the House passage, then passing it likewise, we can move forward and address other issues, because this racial disparity, it shouldn't exist. I mean, it has existed over 3 decades at the moment, and we all realized when the changes were made in 2010 to 18 to 1 that people came out of the woodwork speaking that there was no reason that any disparity remained. But at the time, there was a compromise and 18 to 1 was chosen. And I was glad because, as you stated, Heather, I was released because that 18 to 1 ratio change was made retroactive by the First Step Act. And I was released as the first person of the First Step Act in January of 2019. And I still left a lot of people behind. And we know, like I said, based on the fact that there is really no difference between the two drug types, except how they're used, except where they're sold. And because of that, I don't think the ratio or the disparity should exist. So hopefully now that we're addressing it, hopefully now that people are aware of it, hopefully now we see that the damage it has done to, the communities of color, we can do some repairing. And even with the other drugs that are now on the scene, we understand that treatment is necessary. Incarceration should be a last result. As Mr. Matt Whitaker has stated, we attempted or wanted to go at the kingpins, but we ended up getting a lot of low-level defenders, and it just started warehousing the prisons with bodies.
That's great. Thank you so much, Matthew. And I think it's important for us to remember that so many people behind prison walls today, there's more Matthew Charles is waiting, right? And you have done so much in your community since your release. I know God has totally transformed your life and you're giving back in so many ways. And particularly for those who are sitting behind bars for an unjust penalty, that should weigh heavy on our hearts, particularly for those of us who are people of faith. So I'm looking forward to delving more into your story as well, Matthew, but I'm going to move to Frank to introduce Frank Russo from the National District Attorneys Association. He's the Director of Government and Legislative Affairs. And NDAA, for those who aren't familiar, has 5,500 members nationwide. It's recognized as a leading source of national expertise on the prosecution function, a valuable resource for media, academia, government, and community leaders. And Frank, just to frame up your question, tell us, why does NDAA support the Equal Act?
Well, thank you, Heather, and I appreciate you all having us. And really, we got the easiest question in the group, so I'm thankful for that. And hopefully can go a little bit into why we care about this. And it's something that both Matthew and Matt have touched on. Public safety is the core of what our members do at the state and local level. So when we looked at this legislation, the first thing that stood out is that it's been adopted in over 40 states. There's no disparity there. So in those states, this is becoming the status quo, meaning prosecutors are already treating it one way and not seeing the significant harm to our ability to keep communities safe. So during the transition period over the last 2 decades, where we've really recognized that this is something that doesn't make sense for both public safety and the actual treatment of individuals in society, our members haven't identified any increase in local crime or found that the trust in the criminal justice system was decreased. In fact, it was quite the opposite. We saw a growth in the trust in the system, and we were able to work and actually develop relationships that I don't think are possible when we're not on the front edge of actually identifying problems in the system that affect certain communities negatively and don't have any public safety benefit. So I think similar to our federal partners, state and local prosecutors, even when you make this change, still possess all the other criminal charges necessary to hold bad actors accountable. And despite these reduced penalties, it's not taking a tool away from folks on our end to actually hold the accountability standards there, but then build out relationships that can hopefully turn into rehabilitations and stories like Matthew Charles that are successful. I think that's the most valuable piece of this. By over punishing, we're taking away the ability for rehabilitation. So that's really the area and the angle that I think state and local prosecutors have viewed this change through. And it's why it's something we've supported, I think, this entire time, and why we really were surprised internally at Ndaa that it was a unanimous support across all of our members in all 50 states. Even some of those states like Iowa that have yet to make this change, our members are supportive of it because we've seen the public safety benefits play out. We've seen how it actually benefits communities and allows us to build out relationships to reduce violent crime and increase trust in the system so we have less justice involved individuals, which is kind of the goal here. I think for our members, we always say we don't want to see individuals over and over. We want to actually see success stories. And this bill is a really big piece of that. One other thing that I'll touch on is that this isn't just the only bill in the space that's moving. And I think it's a really exciting time for criminal justice reform in that sense. So the Terry Technical Correction Act was introduced, I think, just this morning. And it's very similar to the Equal Act in that it solves a problem that exists in the federal code that shouldn't. So really coming out of a Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court recently held that the First Step Act did not apply to those offenders whose conduct did not trigger the mandatory minimums, which interestingly enough means that the lowest level offenders were not getting those retroactive provisions to get out early under the 18-to-1 change we've already made. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So thankfully, this bill is just a clean clarification that will allow those individuals to apply for retroactivity. Something I know we'll discuss more later today, but I think is really important to this conversation because, like, as we said, there has to be one or two public safety elements to every piece of this, and there really is.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, Frank. That's also legislation that Prison Fellowship supports. So I appreciate you talking a little bit more holistically of what the opportunities are here for folks on the line. For the next few questions, Matt, Matthew, Frank, we're going to try and ask you the skeptic questions. Okay. So I think that that's going to be most beneficial for staff who are listening to this call. So Matt, I'll start with you. We had Frank talk a bit about, public safety really motivating this. You talked about that. Some, though, listening might be aware that, this year we've experienced a small increase in violent crime, right? That's really driven by a large increase in homicide crime in 2021 or in 2020, I should say. And we also know that there's an opiate epidemic going on. So why should we pass the Equal Act in light of those phenomenons?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And as a sort of hardcore prosecutor myself, I'm sure that I have had similar thoughts. Obviously, crack and powder cocaine are entirely different than opioids, especially fentanyl, which is just a deadly killer. Takes very little, laced into other opioids or other drugs to kill people. And so, obviously, that is we do have an overdose epidemic right now in our country, and drug addiction because of lockdowns and the like. And so I think that is something we shouldn't take our eyes off the ball. But obviously, fentanyl is much different than crack and powder cocaine. And this this violent crime epidemic, especially in our major cities, is equally concerning. Obviously, in the 1980s, when crack cocaine hit Los Angeles and New York City and other places, and violent crime exploded, Miami is another example. That was the response. This 100-to-1 ratio that's now been whittled down to a smaller ratio was obviously the politicians wanted, were being demanded to do something about it, and they did. And I just think this epidemic of violent crime in our major cities is just different fundamentally. It's more gang violence, less drug dealing organizations. I think you've seen, as you kind of peel back the onion in our major cities, It's just a fundamentally drug dealing and violent criminal gangs are almost two separate and distinct issues. While at the same time, we have to do everything we can. I know that, while I was at the Department of Justice, we tried to put, for example, more ATF agents into Chicago to, do more with the gun crimes that were happening between the rival gangs. So much of it, where it used to be turf warfare and people were getting killed for turf warfare, it's more beef based. Somebody disrespected somebody else, so they kill somebody, and then that gang was disrespected and they kill somebody else, and it's a tit for tat, complete, to some extent from the outside, from an Iowa kid from Des Moines, Iowa, a ridiculous, set of circumstances we're seeing in the major cities. But we can't ignore that violent crime. There's other tools and abilities for those issues. And so, this issue is really, I think, an equal issue, but it's also focusing federal law enforcement on drug trafficking organizations and not street level drug dealers that can be addressed differently. We need to continue to use our federal resources for the worst of the worst, the most violent people that are crossing state lines and are, or multiple time offenders, and not, kind of people that just happen to hit a quantity that gets them 5 years mandatory minimum or 10 years mandatory minimum. It doesn't make any sense. Or in Matthew's case, 35 years. And that's just the reality of it. And so to some extent, Congress sets those rules, tells federal law enforcement what to do. And I think this fix, will help focus federal law enforcement on some of these other issues like opioid epidemic and violent crime in our major cities.
Thank you for that, Matt. Another skeptical question I hear a lot, Frank, is around retroactivity. And we know that this bill includes retroactivity. First Step Act did. And, a lot of people think that the use of retroactivity will lead to a blanket release of everyone who was sentenced under the previous disparity and will essentially be a jailbreak. So, I know NDAA supports the retroactivity included here. And so share with us why that is and what you would say to someone whose view is that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And obviously, state and local prosecutors don't support jailbreaks. So when we come at this issue, it comes from a sense of it. The question always makes me laugh a little bit, but I do think it needs to be broken down. And really, the good news is, and it's something that Whitaker just touched on about resources, the federal system has actually built out resources. And so when you look at this law, although the bill is short and clean, there is no automatic release for individuals who have these offenses. They actually have to go through a process. And something we've really been able to build out and successfully resource through the First Step Act and subsequent laws. So really, if you're an offender, a previous offender, and you're looking as an incarcerated individual for that, reduction in sentence, you've actually got to start a process on the front end with debriefing with your U.S. Attorney's Office, which is already a big step. From there, when you apply to the court is going to go through a holistic review. They're going to talk with your defense counsel, the prosecutors. Victims are required to be involved in this. State and local prosecutors get a say in the matter. All of these things are a full review that doesn't cut out any piece of the puzzle and allows the court a full picture of what's going on before that release. So we're not taking any chances, and we're not putting anybody's boss, especially in Congress, in the position of just letting folks out without a proper review. So I think that's something that folks need to understand. And then I touched on it at the beginning, but resources are really important here. And what we've seen is that the BOP and the Department of Justice, thanks to obviously Acting Attorney General Whitaker and many others who've stepped up, and I will take the moment to brag on them, have heard from law enforcement and our advocate partners to say, okay, this process needs funding. We need to be able to provide those supervisory release agents to speak with defense counsels, with their clients, to get those processes started and enacted effectively and in a manner that doesn't hold that incarcerated individual longer than they need to be, but also provides that holistic review so we're not risking public safety. I will also tell you, just from a general policy standpoint, NDA is not always going to jump in on retroactivity. We don't always feel like you should go back and question the judgment of prosecutors, federal, state, or local. But here it's a little bit different. We have a direct comparable offense, and we've touched on this a lot today. Crack and powder cocaine scientifically we're looking at the same substance. So if we feel confident that we should have been treating it this one way, the same way the whole time, there's no reason we shouldn't look back and give those individuals a second chance. Rehabilitation stories are what our system should be about, not what our system limits.
Love that. Thank you, Frank. Matthew, I think it's important for people to understand how these lengthy sentences that folks get for whether it's crack cocaine or otherwise really do have consequences that go beyond just the number of years we hear, right? And they have real life impact. I wonder if you could just unpack a little bit about the barriers that you faced as a result of your lengthy sentence and how you work to overcome those in your life.
Okay, thank you, Ella. Yes, the fact that I received the 35-year sentence, when I went in to start serving my prison sentence, there wasn't a lot of programs available to me. I had to personally get involved and change my own life. And as you stated earlier, when you spoke about introducing me, the fact that I found God, I became a Christian, changed things dramatically for me. Actually, it changed me to an entirely different person than the person I was pre-1996. I hate to say that, but that's a true statement. But at the same token, because of that, I went in and I just continued to try to do things to better myself. But the fact that I had 35 years and on a 35-year sentence in the federal prisons at 85%, I was looking at doing 32 years. So therefore, that was a long way to go. And as I stated, the only reason I received such an extensive sentence was because of that disparity between those two drug types. But I just continued to do what I could and try to better myself. And then in 2010, it was changed the ratio to 18-1. And because of that, I actually filed a petition, just like a lot of people that were incarcerated, hoping that would reduce my sentence. And for those that do know my story, of course, federal judge Kevin Sharp did reduce my sentence. I was released and then I was ordered to go back because the prosecutor appealed it and said that it didn't apply. But it affected me in the sense that when I went in, my daughter was 8. When I came out, she was 30. If I had received a sentence for 11.2 grams of cocaine, which was the equivalent to my 216 grams of crack cocaine under the 1994 federal sentencing guidelines, I would have been home in 6 years. But again, I had some other specifics in my case that would have mandated that I receive a 15-year sentence, which was still 20 years less than what I was given because of the disparity. So it impacted me greatly. That's the reason I moved personally because of my own situation and for all those people that I met throughout my period of incarceration that have I'm just extensive sentences only because the disparity exists. But as I stated, once I came back out, I ran into problems trying to get a place to stay due to the fact that I was a felon, due to the fact that I had no credit history. When it came to technology, I mean, it's funny because I joke around with my boss, Kevin, sometime, or made the statement sometime that the fact that I was able to pick up a phone and get some Google research on anything I put in, as opposed to picking up a hardback encyclopedia. I mean, as far as technology, I went in there and it was like I came out and I was still in the Stone Age, so the fact that those extensive sentences actually don't work, they don't deter people from using the drug or selling the drug. All it did was, as I stated earlier in my opening remarks, it's just housing the prison with people's bodies.
Thanks for that, Matthew. Yeah, I think, especially for someone in that time frame that you were behind bars, the technology piece when people come out is a massive learning curve for sure. Matt, coming back to you as it relates to, some people might be skeptical about whether or not powder versus crack cocaine really should be punished the same way. And I think that there are some common questions we get about differences. One of them being, if we looked at folks' criminal history or possession, wouldn't crack cocaine defendants be shown to be a higher public safety risk than powder cocaine? So I wonder if you could speak to that from your experience.
Yeah, I just don't think that the data bears that out. And I think, the wonderful thing about the, DOJ and the Sentencing Guidelines Commission is there's a tremendous amount of data on this. I think there's a lot of what I would call anecdotal beliefs, whether it's what you just described, Heather, or things like rehabilitation. I mean, we have data on that, and the Justice Statistics Bureau, or Bureau of Justice Statistics, says essentially that as far as rehabilitation, there's two things that we have data that prove. One is the RDAP program, which is the residential treatment. It's a years-long program that gives people drug treatment help and support, and the other is the prison industry's work and training. And so I know we in First Step that I was involved in, we worked very hard to make sure that we were cognizant of what the data suggested. And I'm always, I love to try, pilot programs in all these various places. I offered during the First Step process and afterwards that DOJ would do, we got plenty of facilities. We could always, A/B test any of your theories on kind of, who has a better outcome as far as, rehabilitation and reoffense. And I think the federal government actually does it the best. There's, data out there that I'm a little skeptical of that would suggest that, certain states have had better outcomes than the federal government. I'm not sure, especially if you're dealing with a apples to apples, criminal history. But, long story short is I just don't think you can look at an individual's criminal history, and which is already included in their sentencing. I think in this case, we're talking about things like mandatory minimums and the like, and again, we need to go as a federal law enforcement group, as DOJ, we need to go after the worst of the worst. And, that is the international drug trafficking organizations in my experience. And I know that, while the nuisance of the corner drug dealer selling crack is on is in everybody's face, and local police invest a lot of time and effort, I just, think that this disparity makes it easy for federal law enforcement to not focus on the right thing, which is those international DTOs.
That's right. And we actually just got a question from the audience that might be pretty quick to cover for you, Matt. They're just asking whether or not federal law takes into account simple possession versus possession with intent to distribute, or are the quantity guidelines supposed to capture possession with intent to distribute?
I'm going to be embarrassed. I'm going to give a logic answer, which is, it's all about quantity. The intent, the objective intent and mens rea is not calculated that. It's all just weight and quantity. And so obviously when you get to a certain quantity, it's not personal use amounts. And I think that is, since I, thank God, knock on wood, have never, used or been addicted to drugs, I really can't speak to, those quantities or amounts that would be a difference between somebody's personal use amount and somebody's, distribution quantity. But that is certainly something, if you're going after drug trafficking organizations, you're going to want to go against quantities that are not just personal use quantities. I've had a lot of discussions, especially, and maybe Frank, has a lot more local experience with sort of, personal use quantities, but, we need to certainly, as we look at this and make this policy decision, capture the people that are distributing and not just using. But my understanding is even for 5 years, that would be a monster amount of crack for an individual to use.
Yeah, I think, that's a common question we get even from a lot of our advocates, is when we're talking about drug charges in the federal system. I mean, I think you probably count on two hands, like the number of people who are there for possession charges. So we usually are talking about people who are involved in intent to distribute. But I think it's also important to note that there's a whole spectrum, as Matt was just speaking of.
Yeah. Can I say one other thing, Heather?
Of course.
I think obviously those drug charges, whether it's a possession, whether it's a possession with intent, kind of however it's characterized. And, again, it's just a box checking when you look at the data from stand back and look at the data. I think the risk is that oftentimes maybe that's a negotiated resolution, because over 95% of federal cases plead. And so, there's a lot of negotiation as to what the charges are or should be. A lot of sometimes negotiation on weight and what can be proven, either at sentencing or agreement. So I just would, if you see a 24, let's say, possession charges, I don't think that tells you the whole story about those cases, at least in my experience.
Thanks for that clarification. Yeah, absolutely. And keep those questions coming from the audience. We want to make sure we cover what, you have outstanding questions on. I will continue with my skeptics questions. So hopefully those are some of the ones you guys have in mind. But Matthew, I wonder if you could cover one we get a lot too, which is, isn't crack cocaine more addictive than powder cocaine? And that's why we should punish it more harshly. And so I'll let you answer that. Frank, if you want to jump in with any other thoughts, feel free after.
Okay. My response to that is no, as Frank has stated, there's no scientific difference. As I stated in my opening remarks, there's no pharmacological difference. The only difference between those two drug types is the way they're ingested and the areas of the people that utilize them. We both know that all drugs are dangerous and addictive. So to say that crack cocaine is more addictive than powder cocaine, I would say that's a fallacy. But at the same time, we do know in 1986, when crack cocaine hit the scene and Congress decided, to act, we understood that they was doing it based off of what they was understanding at the time about crack cocaine. And the fact that people, I hate to say it, that, live in, poor communities, didn't have the resources to utilize powder cocaine, well, they were buying the crack cocaine because the crack cocaine was significantly lesser than powder cocaine. And the crack cocaine was in the areas that they were, used to, or the communities that they were used to. So the argument that one is more addictive than the other, I would say no, in the sense that all drugs are dangerous and addictive. I believe that the reason it was raised to 101 was the fear behind the unknown. Anytime there's a fear behind the unknown, people are, quick to act. And now that we see that they acted in haste and there's really no reason why there should be any disparity between the two drugs, hopefully, like I said, this year, the Senate will remove that disparity and make that equivalent to powder cocaine. So I would say, in answer to your question, Heather, no, it's not more addictive. We do hear that argument. We do hear people that ask. And a lot of times when they ask that, it's because, I hate to say it, so many people of color at that time were using crack cocaine. And because they were now seeing all these people in these communities utilizing crack cocaine, whereas they don't really get to see those that use, powder cocaine that much, because they were, some of them are, were businessmen, that had the money and resources to actually utilize it. So the fact that they were able to see more people of color on crack cocaine or selling crack cocaine, they use that as a premise to say that this drug is more addictive than powder cocaine.
Thanks for that, Matthew. Anything else you'd want to speak to that, Frank, as well as I also wonder if we could speak a little bit about, some people might pose, why not just make the powder cocaine threshold higher? Won't that solve the problem? So maybe you could speak to both of those issues.
Sure, and that's my second favorite question we get, because it's another simple answer, and it's something that I think both Matt and Matthew have hinted at, which is the threat profile on drugs have changed. I think at the state and local level, we're seeing something very similar to our federal partners, which is fentanyl is the main substance that is causing issues. And so raising that actual disparity, or raising the amount of cocaine to get it to powder cocaine to crack cocaine, all it does is focus resources in the wrong place. And that, for the state and local partners, who a lot of times we are lacking the resources, time, and availability to go at this, never made sense from our perspective. It's why in 40 states we didn't take those actions. And in fact, it kind of contradicts what we're hearing from our state and local prosecutors on the ground, which is we need to be pushing our efforts towards trust building in communities to get these new drugs and these new threat profiles off the streets. And two, we need to make sure that our laws are tailored in a way that they address the most specific and immediate threats, and are tailored in a way, and Matthew touched on this earlier, that are focused on treatment and rehabilitation, not just punishment. Because that's, I think, the past mistake that we can't make with even certain substances like fentanyl that are extremely deadly. We still need to punish the bad offenders. We still need to focus on those criminal organizations from the top level. But at the state and local area, you're focused on a lot of users and individual corner dealers that we need to break up and get into rehabilitation and get them off this unfortunate, let's say, career path. So first reason is the threat profile has changed. So adding and allocating laws and resources to the wrong place actually harms our abilities to do things. The second piece is, as we mentioned, with it being done in over 40 states where we've already equaled out these disparities, for the federal government to do something that's quite the opposite and going north instead of south here, I think actually takes credence and credibility away from state and local law enforcement who have actually advocated for these changes to be reduced, to say to communities, we seriously understand that there was a targeting of the wrong communities here and that there was a mistreatment that understandably now views you, would not put you in a position to work with us to remove and reduce things like violent crime and drug threats on the streets that are existing today, like through fentanyl. So it actually works backwards for us and puts our state and local law enforcement in a difficult position if the federal government or Congress is speaking in one voice to say, no, we actually want to punish these additionally. That's going to be a hard argument even for our state and locals to go back on the ground and make to the communities. I think it'll actually deter a lot of the cooperation we're starting to see.
Right, right. And Frank, I want to stay on that for just a moment. As we look to how states are treating this issue, we know that the vast majority, I believe it's over 40 states, do treat how they punish crack and powder cocaine the same, right? So there's a 1-to-1 ratio. However, a skeptical question we might get is that not all states, including those without a crack cocaine disparity, have lower weight threshold than 500 grams for triggering the crack cocaine mandatory minimum. And so if federal law was to arrive at the 1-to-1 ratio, shouldn't the federal threshold be lower, some might ask. So wonder if you could address that for us too.
Absolutely, and I'll also let Matt speak to this a little bit. The federal focus is narrower, and we touched on this. The amount of people who you're looking at for possession cases are 2 hands is probably over getting, but maybe 2 hands on a good day. And so we're really, I think in that case, over focusing the effort and trying to tailor. States are going to have different challenges, and state and local jurisdictions are going to have different abilities and practices and prosecution for these type of offenses and for these type of drugs that I think they do need to be tailored differently than the federal government. Federal government as is has this current standard and these current weights. So doing what we're doing and setting it lower and making sure that we're set at the level we're at makes a lot of sense. For one, not confusing our U.S. attorney partners, but 2, not trying to make the federal government do what the state and localities are doing in a very unique jurisdiction, let's say in Hawaii compared to Georgia, where I'm from. I think you're really kind of circling a little bit too much of the wagon there and creating a confusing process by trying to tailor certain states to the federal government. The same way we don't want the federal government to tailor all of our states to be the same either. We want our ability to address, thresholds and weight and powder thresholds on the ways that work best for our prosecutors and state and local law enforcement on the ground. So I think that's really the answer there is the same. It's a federalism question in a sense. Federal government treats it this way. I think we should allow them to continue to, once we hit that 1-to-1 and remove that disparity from a sentencing perspective. And then we also shouldn't be changing how states have already made the options, especially those 40 plus states that have already put it at 1-to-1. Their weight thresholds need to be where they are, because that's what their state and local communities have said. This is the most effective way for us to both, make sure we're holding folks accountable, but not over punishing the offense.
Matt, did you have anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I reserve the right to be a little off topic, but
sure.
The federal law enforcement, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. We force and insist on cooperative law enforcement with the state and local police and sheriff's deputies and the like, who are, really, I always describe it as they're 911 and we're 912. The federal law enforcement isn't on the street dealing with street corner drug dealers. At the same time, if we're doing it right, we're collaborating, coordinating, where we have, task force officers who are, brought on to, federal task forces and given resources that they wouldn't otherwise have to encourage that coordination. The challenge we face, and I know so many people on this call, this is a conservative, meeting among folks that, probably agree with me and see it my way. When you end up with cashless bail and some of these other policies, local law enforcement is fighting with both hands tied behind their back. And so, they need the federal government to get some of the worst off the streets. And I think that's the tension as we look at some of, and New York City is a prime example that has implemented some of these very far left policies that hamstring law enforcement, and really puts a lot more pressure on the federal law enforcement assets to take some people that they wouldn't otherwise take, that folks like, in Frank's organization should be taking, but they just can't get the local judges, and to hold them, and they can't get the local judges to sentence them. So you have these sort of repeat offenders, and, it's really, it's big. DOJ can't solve this problem alone. And I see this actually as one tool to help with that, to, again, to focus the federal resources on the DTOs, the drug trafficking organizations that are oftentimes international. And we have to work with our international partners as well to solve some of this, but to also, kind of have a clear line as I hear you, New York City Police Department, I want to help you, but we're not going to federalize the drug crimes and take every, kind of low-level drug dealer off the streets for you, because, it's just not our purpose and intent. Otherwise, you're going to just see a real misallocation of federal law enforcement resources to places that locally have, this is Matt Whitaker talking, crazy policies.
Thank you for that, Matt. I'm going to put a final call out to those who are on the line. If you've got a question you didn't get to ask, please put it in the chat, because I've got one more skeptic question, but if we have anyone from the audience come in, we will address that for you. So final question to anyone who'd like to answer is, some might look at the decline in crack cocaine crimes in the 90s and say, well, hey, the 100-to-1 disparity contributed to this. And so what would be anyone's response to that?
Okay, go. Frank, you wanted it? Okay, Heather, you said the fact that the drop in the crack cocaine usage could be attributed to the fact that it was 100-to-1. Was that your question? Okay, now I would say that would be definitely incorrect assumption. The fact that in 1986, when it was made 100-to-1, actually, if you pull up the statistics of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, you will see all the people in there with life sentences for this nonviolent drug offense. And the fact that there's less usage, there's just more drugs that have come about. Every year somebody, comes up with a new type of drug, and just like crack cocaine, when it came on the scene, it was a new drug and people didn't understand it and were moved in fear and came up with the 100-to-1 ratio. Just like today, there's opioids and methamphetamine. So the fact that there's less drug use of crack cocaine, I kind of hate to say this, but it also may mean that people have just gravitated toward a new drug type, but at the same time, it wasn't because the ratio was made 100-to-1. Actually, that was the direct opposite. If you look at the actual devastation of the communities of the people that it actually affected. And the fact that there are still so many people that are incarcerated with life sentences. As I stated, I did 22 years before I was released, and I would still be in there today until 2029 had it not been lowered to 18-to-1. So I wouldn't say that you can attribute to the less usage of crack cocaine being that the fact that 100-to-1 was a deterrent. No, the 100-to-1 wasn't deterrent. It didn't stop people from selling the drug, and then stop people from using the drug. All it did was just incarcerated people and replace those low-level offenders with somebody new to take their place once they were off the street. So I would say the fact that hopefully some people have received treatment, let me say that, have received treatment and no longer use drugs, period. But also the fact that there are so many different drugs out there now that people may have just gravitated to a new drug. But to attribute any 100-to-1 ratio or 18-to-1 ratio as a deterrent to people actually utilizing the drug or selling the drug, I would say is a fallacy, and hopefully nobody believes that. Nobody should believe that.
And Matthew touched on something I think that's great. We've gotten a whole heck of a lot better at treating people, and we need to continue to do that. So this isn't something you can arrest your way out of, but in the same sentence, you can't take the tools away from law enforcement. That's what Matt was just touching on. If you do that, you're running into the exact opposite problem. So to make the argument that the over penalizing is what leads to the decrease, it's not. It's things like treatment. Unfortunately, it's the things like new threat profiles for new drugs, and there's ways to get at that both from the enforcement and the treatment side. So really balancing enforcement and treatment is the answer and the solution here. And this is one piece of that puzzle, but without this piece, you don't get to the second part, and you're not able to put it all together. So that's a reality we're facing on the ground and needs to be addressed, I think, across the board.
Thanks for that, Frank. And I haven't seen any more questions come in. So I'm going to give everyone, if anyone has something they were itching to say, they didn't get to say, speak now or forever hold your peace, panelists. Any last words? And then I'm going to take moderator's privilege and give my last word. No? Okay, well, I just want to thank so much Matthew Charles, Frank Russo, Matt Whitaker for being on the panel today, sharing your expertise with us and taking time to do that. I want to thank our co-hosts, FAM, Justice Action Network, Due Process Institute. If you didn't get to ask a question or you've got more questions after this based on what was said, I hope that you'll follow up with one of our organizations. We'd love to talk to you. Please do check out the legislation introduced by Senator Booker on the Senate side. Take a look at the House vote. Like I said, overwhelming support coming from the House. And, if that's not a signal that the Senate needs to take this up, I don't know what is. But just looking at the vast support from conservatives and so many different members on the House side from the Republican Party who have supported this legislation, and the diversity of conservative, faith-based and law enforcement groups represented here and in the coalition who support the Equal Act. The time is now to do this. And so we would urge you to do so. And we look forward to following up with questions and seeing you all take action in the Senate. Thank you so much for your time today.